What happens when a single moment of arrogance, a petty display of power at 35,000 feet, collides with a reality you could never have predicted? This isn't just a story about a flight attendant who picked the wrong passenger to bully. It's a gripping tale of hidden identities, devastating consequences, and the shocking ways our lives are intertwined. You'll witness a woman publicly humiliated for wanting a simple glass of wine, and the man who owned the very plane she was on stepping in. But the story doesn't end there. The fallout goes far beyond a single lost job, spiraling into a life-altering crisis that proves the world is terrifyingly small. The gentle hum of the twin Rolls-Royce engines was a familiar lullaby to Elara Vance. For her, the first-class cabin of an Orion Air A350 was less a luxury and more a mobile office, a sterile sanctuary between the chaotic construction sites of her present and the gleaming glass and steel monoliths of her future. At 34, Elara was the principal architect and founding partner of Vance & Associates, a boutique firm that had, against all odds, become the darling of the hyper-modern architectural world. Her latest triumph, the Serafina Tower in Chicago, had just broken ground, a twisting spire of residential art that had graced the cover of Architectural Digest. This flight from New York to London was supposed to be a celebration, a moment to decompress. She had just signed a landmark deal to design the new European headquarters for Innovatec, a tech giant whose name was synonymous with futuristic innovation. She was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that came from months of 16-hour days, endless revisions, and the immense pressure of managing a project worth north of $900 million. She had intentionally dressed down for the flight, a simple, impeccably tailored cashmere tracksuit in a soft dove grey and a pair of pristine white leather sneakers. Her long dark hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and her face was free of makeup. She looked younger than her years, more like a graduate student than a titan of industry. To the undiscerning eye, she might not have looked like she belonged in Seat 2A, a private suite that cost more than the average monthly salary. But Elara Vance had stopped caring about the undiscerning eye long ago. Her work spoke for itself. As the aircraft reached its cruising altitude, the lead flight attendant for the first-class cabin approached her suite. The woman's name tag read Brenda. She was perhaps in her late 40s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a smile practiced in a mirror, designed for service, but devoid of warmth. "Can I get you something to drink before the meal service, miss?" Brenda asked, her tone clipped and efficient. "Yes, thank you," Elara replied, her own voice warm despite her fatigue. "I'd love a glass of the Chateau Margaux, please." It was a simple request. The 2005 Margaux was one of Orion Air's much-advertised treasures, a jewel in their first-class wine cellar. Elara had been looking forward to it, a small, well-deserved indulgence. Brenda's professional smile flickered for a fraction of a second, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around her mouth. She glanced at Elara's casual attire, her youthful face, and a silent, swift calculation was made. "The Margaux, miss," Brenda repeated, as if Elara had misspoken. "That is a very premium selection." Elara blinked, slightly taken aback. "Yes, that's why I'd like a glass." "Of course," Brenda said, the smile now strained. "It's just that we have a lovely Cabernet Sauvignon that is already open. It pairs wonderfully with the beef entree." She was suggesting a lesser wine, a house red, as if Elara couldn't possibly appreciate the difference. The subtext was clear. You don't belong here, and you certainly don't deserve this. Elara felt a prickle of annoyance, but she kept her composure. "Thank you for the suggestion, Brenda, But my heart is set on the Margot. I'm not eating for a while yet." Brenda's face hardened. The mask of politeness was slipping. "I'll have to see if we have a bottle available for single glass service. Sometimes they are reserved for our highest tier loyalty members." It was a blatant lie, and they both knew it. Ryanair's policy was clear: all listed wines were available to any first-class passenger. Elara had flown this route dozens of times. Brenda was creating a rule that didn't exist, constructing a barrier based on pure judgment. "I'm quite sure you'll find it's available," Elara said, her tone now cool and firm. "Please check for me." Brenda gave a curt nod. "I'll be back," she said, before turning on her heel and disappearing behind the curtain into the galley. Elara sighed, leaning her head back against the plush leather. This was exactly the kind of petty annoyance she flew first class to avoid. It wasn't about the wine anymore. It was about the principle. She had paid for a service, for an experience of seamless comfort, and she was being met with a wall of condescension. She looked out the window at the endless expanse of blue, the curvature of the earth, a faint, majestic line on the horizon. Down below, the world was a complex tapestry of lives and struggles. Up here, in this gilded cage, she had expected a temporary reprieve. Instead, she had found the same wearying human judgments, just delivered with a practiced smile. The celebration was already starting to feel sour. Minutes ticked by, stretching into an uncomfortable length of time. The sounds of the cabin continued around Elara, the gentle clinking of cutlery from another suite, the rustle of a newspaper, the low murmur of a conversation. Yet her own small world in Suite 2A remained an island of neglect. Brenda was making a point, and her absence was the weapon. When she finally reappeared, she was carrying a tray, but it held only a crystal glass of sparkling water with a slice of lime. She placed it on the polished burl wood console next to Elara with a definitive click. "I'm so sorry, miss." Brenda began, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "It seems we are unable to open a new bottle of the Chateau Margaux at this time. As I mentioned, they are often allocated. Perhaps the sparkling water would be a refreshing alternative for now." The lie was so bald-faced, so insulting in its transparency, that Elara was momentarily stunned into silence. It wasn't an apology. It was a dismissal. Brenda was doubling down, assuming Elara would be too intimidated or too unsophisticated to challenge her further. "Brenda," Elara said, her voice dropping to a low, serious register, "I am a paying passenger in a first-class suite. I requested an item from your advertised menu. Are you telling me that the airline is unable to fulfill that request?" Brenda's facade of customer service crumbled, completely replaced by a cold, defensive front. "I'm telling you what is available, miss. Our policies are in place to ensure fairness and to manage our premium stock." "Fairness?" Elara countered, a flash of disbelief in her eyes. "There are 4 other passengers in this cabin. Do you intend to deny all of them this wine as well, or is this policy specific to me?" The directness of the question seemed to fluster Brenda. Her gaze darted away for a moment. "It's a matter of operational procedure." Inside the galley, a younger flight attendant named Chloe had watched the exchange with growing unease. She knew Brenda's moods. Brenda Hoskins had been with the airline for over 20 years. She was ruthlessly efficient and knew the rule book inside and out, but she was also jaded with a sharp, judgmental streak that she usually kept hidden from the platinum card holders. She saw the first-class cabin as her personal fiefdom, and she was the gatekeeper. Chloe knew for a fact there were 6 bottles of the Margaux chilling in the wine cooler. "Just give her the wine." "Bren," Chloe whispered when Brenda returned to the galley, her face a thundercloud. "What's the big deal? She's in 2A. She paid her dues." "You don't get it." Brenda snapped back, her voice a venomous hiss. "Look at her. Dressed like she's going to the gym. Probably some little influencer who scammed her way into an upgrade, hoping for freebies. If you give them an inch, they take a mile. They think a first-class ticket makes them royalty. She needs to be taught a little lesson in humility." Chloe shrank back. She didn't agree, but she knew better than to argue when Brenda was like this. Brenda's bitterness was a shield she wore, but today it felt more like a weapon. Back in her suite, Ilara was seething. The exhaustion had been replaced by a cold, focused anger. It was the audacity that galled her, the sheer, unadulterated snobbery. She had fought tooth and nail for every ounce of her success. She had shattered glass ceilings in a male-dominated field, endured skepticism and condescension from men in pinstripe suits who underestimated her. To be so casually belittled by a flight attendant over a glass of wine felt like a grotesque parody of the very struggles she thought she had overcome. She pressed the call button again. Brenda took her time responding. When she finally appeared, her expression was one of exasperated patience. "Yes, miss. I would like to speak to your purser, please, the head of the cabin crew." A flicker of triumph sparked in Brenda's eyes. This was a familiar move. The disgruntled passenger escalating the complaint. She was ready for it. "I am the purser for the first-class cabin, miss. All customer service issues on this deck are handled by me." It was another power play, positioning herself as the final authority. "I see," Ilara said slowly, her mind racing. She could make a scene. She could raise her voice demand to see the captain write a scathing complaint upon landing. But that wasn't her style. It felt undignified. It would be conceding to Brenda's narrative that she was just another entitled passenger. She decided on a different tack. "Very well, Brenda. In that case, I will have the water for now, but please be advised this conversation is not over. Not by a long shot." Brenda gave a tight, victorious smile. "As you wish, miss. Let me know if you require anything else." She turned and walked away, her posture radiating smug satisfaction. She believed she had won. She had successfully put the upstart in her place, reinforced the unspoken hierarchy she held so dear. She had no idea that she had just sealed her own fate. Ilara Vance sat back, took a slow sip of the unwanted water, and felt a steely resolve harden within her. The celebration could wait. Now it was a matter of justice. About an hour into the flight, long after the tension had settled into a cold, simmering silence, a figure emerged from the front of the aircraft. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and distinguished with a mane of silver hair and eyes that held a spark of restless energy. He wore a beautifully tailored charcoal suit, but no tie, lending him an air of relaxed authority. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who was completely at home in this environment, more so than anyone else. He wasn't a passenger from the other suites. He had come from the cockpit where he'd been chatting with the pilots. This was Mr. Alistair Finch, and he didn't just fly Orion Air, he owned it. Alistair Finch was a legend in the aviation industry. A self-made billionaire who had started with a single leased aircraft and built Orion Air into the world's most exclusive airline by focusing obsessively on one thing: unparalleled customer experience. He was known for making surprise appearances on his own flights, testing the service and ensuring his standards were being met. Brenda saw him, and her blood ran cold. A visit from Finch was the stuff of nightmares and legends among the crew. It meant you were under the microscope. She immediately plastered on her most impeccable service smile and approached him. "Mr. Finch, what an unexpected surprise. A pleasure to have you on board with us today," she gushed. "Brenda," He acknowledged with a nod, his eyes scanning the cabin. "Everything running smoothly, I trust?" "Absolutely, sir. A perfect flight. Our guests are all very comfortable." His gaze continued to sweep the cabin, and then it locked onto Suite 2A. A broad, genuine smile broke across his face, transforming his stern features into something warm and paternal. "Good Lord," he chuckled, striding purposefully towards Ilara's suite. "I thought my eyes were deceiving me." Ilara looked up, and her frustration melted away, replaced by genuine surprise and delight. "Alistair, what on earth are you doing here?" She stood up, and Alistair Finch, the owner of the entire airline, wrapped her in a warm hug and planted a fatherly kiss on her cheek. "I should ask you the same, my dear Ilara. On your way to London to charm the Innovatic board, I assume I read about the deal. Astonishing work. Truly. Your father would have been bursting with pride." Brenda stood frozen a few feet away, her own manufactured smile now looking like a grotesque mask. Her mind struggled to process the scene. The girl in the tracksuit, the one she had dismissed as a cheap freeloader, was on a first-name basis with Alistair Finch. Not just that, but he clearly adored her. The kiss on the cheek wasn't just a greeting. It was an endorsement, a public display of affection and esteem that echoed through the silent cabin like a gunshot. The other passengers were now watching, their curiosity piqued. "He would have been insufferable, you mean?" Ilara laughed, her mood completely lifted. "He'd be handing out business cards to everyone on the plane." "As he should have been," Alistair said, his smile still beaming. "Now they tell me you're celebrating. We need to toast this properly. I was hoping they still had a bottle of that 05 Margot. It's one of my personal favorites." He turned his gaze toward Brenda, his smile vanishing, replaced by a glacial calm. "Brenda, be a dear, and fetch us 2 glasses and a bottle of the Margot. Would you? The best architect in the world deserves the best wine in the sky." The color drained from Brenda's face. She was trapped. Every word from Alistair's mouth was a nail in her professional coffin. The best architect in the world. He hadn't just validated Ilara, he had elevated her to a status Brenda couldn't even comprehend. "Sir, Mr. Finch, She stammered, her mind a frantic mess of excuses. "I informed the passenger that we were managing stock." Alistair's eyes narrowed. He hadn't missed the earlier tension, the untouched glass of water, the look on Ilara's face when he had first approached. He was a master at reading people and situations. "You informed her of what, Brenda?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Did you refuse to serve one of my most valued guests? Is that the new Orion Air policy?" He didn't look at Ilara. He kept his steely gaze locked on his employee. "No, sir, of course not. It was a misunderstanding." Brenda pleaded, her voice trembling. "There is no misunderstanding," Alistair stated, his voice now carrying the cold weight of command. "I built this airline's reputation on a single promise that every passenger, especially in this cabin, is treated with the utmost respect and grace. A promise you have just broken right in front of my eyes. You judged a passenger based on her appearance, and then you lied to her. To me. That is not a misunderstanding. That is an unforgivable failure." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "Get the wine, and then report to the galley. The purser from business class will take over your duties for the remainder of the flight. When we land at Heathrow, have your personal belongings packed. You will be met at the gate by human resources. Your employment with Orion Air is terminated." A collective silent gasp seemed to pass through the cabin. It was brutal, swift, final. Brenda stood there, her face ashen, her world collapsing in a matter of seconds. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, but one look at Alistair Finch's implacable expression told her it was useless. Humiliated, she turned without another word and stumbled towards the galley, her 2 decades of service erased by one catastrophic act of pride. Alistair turned back to Ilara, his warm smile returning as if nothing had happened. "Now," he said softly. "Where were we? Ah, yes, a celebration." The walk from the first-class cabin to the galley was the longest of Brenda Hoskins's life. Each step was a fresh wave of humiliation. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her back, their whispers like tiny, sharp needles. In the galley, Chloe averted her gaze, her face a mixture of pity and fear. Brenda didn't say a word. She mechanically retrieved a bottle of the Chateau Margaux and 2 Baccarat glasses, her hands trembling so violently she was afraid she would drop them. She handed the tray to Chloe. "Take this to Mr. Finch," she mumbled, unable to face them again. The rest of the flight was a blur of shame. She sat on a jump seat in the galley, staring at the sterile metal walls, the sounds of the first-class service, the laughter, the clinking of glasses she should have been pouring, filtering through the curtain like a form of exquisite torture. When the plane landed at Heathrow, she moved like a ghost. As promised, a stern-faced woman from HR was waiting at the jet bridge. Brenda was escorted to a small, windowless office where she was handed a box for her personal effects and a termination letter that cited gross misconduct and failure to adhere to core company values. There was no negotiation, no severance package beyond her legally required dues. 23 years of service gone. The days that followed were a descent into a grey, featureless hell. Brenda didn't tell her husband Mark right away. She couldn't bear the shame. Every morning she would get dressed in her old uniform, leave the house at her usual time, and spend the day sitting in coffee shops or wandering aimlessly through London parks, nursing a single cup of lukewarm coffee for hours. Their life, which had always felt so stable, was, in fact, a house of cards. Mark, a talented but unassuming project manager in the construction sector, had been laid off 6 months prior when his firm downsized. He was 52, and the job market was brutal for men his age. They were living entirely on Brenda's substantial salary and their rapidly dwindling savings. The mortgage on their modest suburban home in Surrey was a constant looming threat. Her job wasn't just a job, it was their lifeline. After a week of her charade, the lie became too heavy to carry. One evening, Mark was excitedly telling her about a promising lead, a final round interview he'd secured for a senior project manager role. It was the best prospect he'd had in months, a true lifeline. "It's with Innovatec, Bren," he said, his face alight with a hope she hadn't seen in a long time. "They're building a massive new European headquarters. It's the project of a lifetime. If I get this, we're saved. All of this. It'll all be over." Brenda felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Innovatec. The name from the flight. The name Alistair Finch had mentioned. That's wonderful, honey," she managed to say, her voice hollow. Seeing his hopeful face, she knew she couldn't hide it any longer. The truth came out in a torrent of tears and choked-up confessions. She told him everything: the young woman in the tracksuit, the argument over the wine, the sudden appearance of Alistair Finch, the brutal public firing. Mark listened in stunned silence, his initial excitement evaporating, replaced by a growing dread. He sank into a chair, his face pale. He wasn't angry with her. He was terrified for them. "Brenda." "Why?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" "I don't know." She sobbed, the honest, ugly truth tearing out of her. "I was stressed. I felt old, unseen. And she was just sitting there looking so young and entitled, and I just snapped. I wanted to feel like I had some control just for a minute. It was stupid. It was so stupid. They sat in the wreckage of their new reality, the silence in their small living room more deafening than any argument. The hope that had filled the room moments before was now gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their situation. They had no income. Their savings were almost gone. And Mark's only real chance at salvation was with the very company whose star architect, Brenda, had just so spectacularly managed to humiliate. A company whose new headquarters was the project he was interviewing for. The cruel irony was suffocating. For the first time, Brenda Hoskins understood the true meaning of a freefall. Mark prepared for his interview with the grim determination of a soldier heading into a final desperate battle. He spent 2 days researching Innovatec, memorizing their corporate ethos, and studying the public-facing plans for their new headquarters. The building itself was a marvel of design, an ambitious fusion of sustainable technology and biophilic architecture. It was exactly the kind of challenging legacy project he had dreamed of managing his entire career. On the day of the interview, he put on his best suit, the fabric now a little looser on his frame from months of stress-induced weight loss. Brenda watched him from the doorway, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. "You'll be brilliant, Mark," she said, trying to inject a confidence she did not feel. He gave her a weak smile. "Let's hope brilliant is enough." The Innovatec temporary offices were sleek and minimalist, a hive of focused energy. Mark was ushered into a glass-walled conference room, where 2 people were waiting for him, a senior executive from Innovatec, and to his surprise, a consultant. The consultant was introduced as the lead representative from the architectural firm. The interview started well. Mark spoke passionately about his experience, his methodology for managing complex builds, and his vision for bringing the new headquarters to life on time and under budget. He felt a spark of his old self, the confident, capable manager he used to be. The Innovatec executive, a man named David Chen, was clearly impressed. "Your resume is excellent, Mr. Hoskins, and your passion for the project is evident. Now, as you know, the most critical relationship on a build like this is between the project manager and the lead architect. They need to be in perfect sync." He gestured to the consultant. "That's why we've asked a senior partner from the firm to sit in on these final interviews. They have final approval on who we hire." It was at that moment that Mark's carefully constructed composure began to crack. He had been so focused on Innovatec that he hadn't given enough thought to the architectural firm itself. David Chen continued, "The firm Vance & Associates has a very specific way of working. Their principal, Ms. Ilara Vance, is a genius, but she is famously demanding. She expects absolute excellence. The project manager will be reporting directly to her on all creative and structural integrations." Vance. The name hit Mark like a physical blow. Ilara Vance, the name Alistair Finch had used on the plane, the best architect in the world. Brenda's story, which had felt like a distant, surreal nightmare, suddenly crashed into his present reality. He could almost hear her sobbing confession. "The girl in the tracksuit, the one who got me fired." He must have turned pale because the consultant looked at him with concern. "Mr. Hoskins, are you all right?" Mark swallowed hard, his throat suddenly bone dry. "Yes, fine. Just processing. Vance & Associates. Of course. The Serafina Tower in Chicago was their project, wasn't it? Groundbreaking work." He was rambling, trying to sound professional, while his mind was screaming. This was it. The ultimate dead end. His family's entire future, their home, their ability to survive, rested in the hands of the very woman his wife had tried to humiliate. There was no way Elara Vance, after what Brenda had done, would ever approve him for this role. To her, the name Hoskins would be poison. She would assume he was part of the same toxic family, or worse, she would relish the opportunity for a quiet, devastating revenge. The rest of the interview passed in a fog. He answered questions on autopilot, his mind a whirlwind of despair. He saw his house being repossessed, saw the look of utter defeat on Brenda's face. He felt the weight of a single foolish act of pride crushing him, destroying the last glimmer of hope he had. When he left the building and stepped out onto the bustling London street, the city noise felt distant and muffled. He didn't take the tube. He just started walking with no destination in mind. He had walked into that building hoping to save his family. He was walking out, knowing with sickening certainty that his wife's actions had already damned them. The intersection of their lives wasn't fateful. It was fatal. When Mark Hoskins returned home, the muted grey light of the late afternoon seemed to cling to him like a shroud. Brenda saw him from the kitchen window as he walked up the path. His shoulders slumped, not with the familiar weariness of a long day, but with the dead weight of absolute defeat. She knew even before he fumbled with the key in the lock that the last fragile thread of hope they had been clinging to had snapped. He didn't speak. He walked past her, his face a pale, vacant mask, and sank onto the living room sofa. He stared at the faded floral pattern on the opposite wall as if it held the secrets to the universe. Brenda's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her chest. "Mark, what is it? What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. He was silent for a long time, the quiet in the room growing heavier, more suffocating with each passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was a monotone stripped of all life. "The firm," he said. "The architects for the Innovatec building. It's Vance and Associates." Brenda frowned, the name vaguely familiar, but not immediately clicking. "And?" Mark turned his head slowly, and his eyes, hollowed out with despair, finally met hers. "The lead architect, the genius everyone talks about, the person who has final say on my hiring, the person I would report to every single day." He paused, letting the weight of the revelation build. "It's her, Bren. Elara Vance." The name slammed into Brenda with the force of a physical blow. Elara Vance, the best architect in the world. Alistair Finch's words from the flight echoed in her mind, a spectral taunt. The girl in the dove-grey tracksuit, the untouched glass of water, the quiet, steely resolve in her eyes. It wasn't just a random passenger she had chosen to bully. It was the pivotal figure in her husband's last chance salvation. The cosmic cruelty of it was so immense, so perfectly targeted, that it felt like a sick joke written by a malevolent god. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "It can't be." "Oh, it is," Mark said with a dry, mirthless chuckle that sounded more like a sob. "I sat there in that glass office, listening to them sing her praises, and all I could picture was you telling me the story. I felt my entire future collapsing in on me." A storm of emotions washed over Brenda. Guilt so potent it was nauseating, shame hot and prickly crawling over her skin, and a terrifying, bottomless despair. Her single stupid, arrogant act of pride hadn't just ended her own career. It had reached out across time and space to sabotage her husband, to poison their entire future. The days that followed were a descent into a shared purgatory. Mark didn't get out of bed. He feigned illness, but they both knew it was a sickness of the soul. He had given up. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a listless apathy. He would just lie there, staring at the ceiling, a prisoner of his wife's mistake. Brenda, in turn, became his helpless warden. She would bring him food he wouldn't eat, and tea he wouldn't drink. Every time she looked at his broken form, she was forced to look at herself. She saw the sneer she had perfected over 20 years. She heard the condescending words she had used. Perhaps sparkling water would be more appropriate. She felt the smug, petty satisfaction of putting someone in their place. How could she have been that person, that bitter, cruel woman who found satisfaction in diminishing others? The self-loathing was a cancer, eating her from the inside out. On the third day, watching Mark stare blankly at a television playing a game show, the laughter from the screen, a grotesque counterpoint to the tomb-like silence of their home, something in Brenda broke. The passive despair finally curdled into a frantic, desperate energy. She couldn't fix what she had done. She couldn't undo her cruelty. But she would not be the reason her good, kind husband simply wasted away. Doing nothing was no longer an option. She had to face the source of the wound. She had to face Elara Vance. The idea was terrifying. She imagined being laughed at, security being called, being humiliated all over again. But the image of Mark's hollow eyes was more terrifying still. She spent an hour online, her hands shaking as she typed, until she found it, Vance and Associates, an address in Mayfair, one of London's most exclusive districts. She put on the simplest, most sombre black dress. She owned a relic from a long-forgotten funeral. It felt appropriate. She was going to plead for a life. She took the train into the city, every clack of the wheels on the track sounding like a tick of a doomsday clock. Standing on the pavement across from the building, she nearly lost her nerve. The firm's entrance was discreet, yet imposing, a heavy oak door with a polished brass nameplate that gleamed with an unapproachable brilliance. It was a world away from her small house in Surrey, a world she had tried to deny Elara entry to. And now she was a beggar at its gates. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she crossed the street and pushed the door open. The reception area was a study in minimalist perfection. Concrete floors, a single perfect orchid on a stark white desk, and a vast abstract painting on the wall that probably cost more than her house. The air smelled of success. The young man at the desk looked up. "Can I help you?" I need to see Miss Elara Vance." Brenda stammered her voice, feeling small and rough in the pristine space. "I don't have an appointment. It's a personal matter of the utmost urgency." The receptionist gave her a practiced, polite smile that was nonetheless a dismissal. "I'm sorry Ms. Vance's schedule is fully committed. She doesn't take unscheduled meetings. Perhaps you could send an email." This was it. The wall. The polite professional rejection she knew was coming. Defeated Brenda was about to turn and leave when a door to her left opened. Elara Vance emerged, deep in conversation with a colleague, holding a large roll of architectural drawings. Time seemed to slow down. Elara laughed at something her colleague said, a genuine, unguarded sound that made Brenda's stomach clench. Then Elara's eyes drifted towards the reception desk and they met Brenda's. The laughter died on her lips. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Then the slow, cold dawn of recognition. Her expression hardened into a mask of impenetrable neutrality. She remembered. Of course she remembered. "I can help you," Elara asked, her voice perfectly level. But the warmth was gone, replaced by a glacial chill that was far more intimidating than any anger. This was her only chance. Brenda stepped forward, her body trembling. "Miss Vance, my name is Brenda Hoskins. I was the flight attendant on the Orion Air flight to London." The receptionist's eyes widened, sensing the sudden monumental shift in the room's atmosphere. "I remember," Elara said, her voice flat. "I came here," Brenda began, her own voice, cracking the carefully rehearsed words, dissolving into a raw, desperate plea. I came to apologize. What I did that day was unforgivable. It wasn't about wine or airline policy. It was about me. It was about my own bitterness, my own fear of getting old and irrelevant. I saw you, and you looked so young and successful and easy. And I hated you for it. It was ugly, and it was pathetic, and it came from the worst part of myself. I am so profoundly, deeply sorry for how I treated you. Elara listened, her face unreadable. She gave a curt nod. Apology accepted. Was there anything else? She began to turn away, a clear dismissal. Please, Brenda cried out, the sound echoing in the quiet lobby. Wait, this isn't about me getting my job back. I deserve to be fired. I know that. This is about my husband, Mark Hoskins. At the mention of the name, Elara froze. She turned back slowly, a new, sharp, calculating light in her eyes. Your husband, he interviewed for the project manager position, for the Innovatec building. Brenda said, tears now streaming down her face, all pretense of composure gone. He's a good man, Miss Vance. He's a brilliant manager. He's been out of work, and this job, it's everything to him. It's the only chance we have left. My name, our name, must be a curse to you. I understand that. But I am begging you, on my knees, do not let what I did destroy him. He is not me. Please judge him for his work, for his skills. Don't punish him for being married to a fool. She stood there, broken and weeping, having laid the full pathetic truth of her situation bare. She had offered up her own humiliation as a sacrifice. Elara Vance stared at her. In that moment, she held all the power. She could have savored it. She could have delivered a cold, cutting remark and had Brenda removed. But as she looked at the shaking, sobbing woman before her, she didn't feel the expected surge of victory. Instead, she felt a wave of profound, weary sadness. She remembered all the times she had been underestimated, judged on her age or her gender. Her own path had been a battle. What she saw in Brenda was a dark, twisted reflection of that same struggle. The fear of being rendered invisible, curdled into a petty poison. She let the silence stretch. Then she asked a question, her voice quiet but piercing. And what would you do, Brenda, if our positions were reversed? If I had behaved so monstrously toward you, costing you your livelihood, and then I appeared before you, begging you to save my family? What would you do? The question hung in the air, a final, brutal test. Brenda looked down, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. She whispered honestly. I don't know if I would have the grace. Elara held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. Your husband is an extremely impressive candidate. He is highly qualified, she stated, her voice returning to its professional tone. The final decision will be based on a single criterion: who is the best person to execute my vision for this building. My professional integrity is not a weapon for personal revenge. I will not punish your husband for your failings. She looked Brenda directly in the eye one last time. But I hope you understand the lesson here. The world is much smaller and more fragile than you think. Be careful what you try to break. With a final sharp nod to the stunned receptionist, Elara Vance turned and walked back through the door to her office, closing it softly behind her. She left Brenda Hoskins, standing alone in the magnificent lobby, trembling not just with relief, but with the soul-shattering weight of unearned mercy. The first time Mark Hoskins walked onto the Innovatec construction site as its official senior project manager, the sheer scale of it stole his breath. Skeletons of steel clawed at the London sky. A forest of cranes stood like silent, patient dinosaurs, and the air buzzed with the chaotic symphony of creation. This was his element, the place where blueprints and dreams were hammered into reality. For a fleeting moment, pure, unadulterated joy washed over him. He was back. The joy was short-lived, chased away by a cold spike of anxiety that had become his constant companion. Today was his first formal project review with Ilara Vance. He found her in the site's main planning office, a sprawling portable cabin filled with renderings and schematics. She wasn't dressed in the casual cashmere he'd heard about. She wore steel-toed boots, rugged cargo pants, and a hard hat, her dark ponytail tucked neatly behind her. She was poring over a structural diagram with an intensity that seemed to bend the very light around her. She didn't look up when he entered. "Hoskins," she said, her voice sharp and clear over the hum of the air conditioner. "You're 3 minutes late." "Apologies, Ms. Vance," Mark said, his heart sinking. Security checkpoint took longer than anticipated. "Anticipate it better next time," she replied without malice, simply stating a fact. She finally looked up, her gaze direct and unnervingly perceptive. It was the same cool, guarded expression from the lobby. "Let's walk the grid for Sector Gamma. I saw a potential sequencing conflict in the rebar placement schedules you submitted. Show me I'm wrong." And so it began. His life was now a series of tests, both explicit and implicit. Ilara Vance was relentlessly professional. She never raised her voice, never showed overt emotion, but her standards were absolute. She demanded a level of perfection that bordered on prescience. Mark found himself working 18-hour days, not just to manage the colossal project, but to stay 3 steps ahead of her. He checked every bolt, every weld, every single line item on every invoice, driven by a gnawing fear that one mistake would be seen not as a professional error, but as a personal failing, a confirmation of the flawed DNA he shared with his wife. The strain bled into his life at home. The modest house in Surrey, once a sanctuary, now felt like a pressure cooker. Brenda would watch him come home, his face etched with a fatigue that was more than physical, and she would feel a fresh wave of guilt. "How was your day?" she'd ask, her voice tentative. "How is—" She's my boss, Bren. That's all," Mark would reply, his tone clipped. He'd retreat to his study to review more documents, leaving a chasm of unspoken words between them. The name Ilara was a ghost in their marriage. For Brenda, it represented her shame and the woman who held their fate in her hands. For Mark, it represented the impossibly high bar he had to clear every single day. The unspoken debt was a constant presence. Ilara had given him this chance, and he felt the crushing weight of that charity in every interaction. He felt he hadn't truly earned his position, he had been granted it. Brenda, meanwhile, was adrift. She applied for administrative jobs, retail positions, anything. But her confidence was shattered. In interviews, the question, "Why did you leave a 23-year career in aviation?" was a landmine she couldn't avoid. Her vague, evasive answers left interviewers unimpressed. She was 50 years old with a resume that ended in disgrace. The world she had known with its clear hierarchies and rule books had vanished. Now she spent her days cleaning the already immaculate house, watching daytime television with the sound off, and feeling her own identity slowly dissolve. One Tuesday evening, the crisis Mark had been dreading finally arrived. It came in the form of an email from the project's lead structural engineer with the subject line, "Urgent anomaly in Sector Delta steel beams." Mark read it, and the blood drained from his face. A random, metallurgical test part of their routine quality control had revealed that a significant portion of the high-tensile steel beams delivered for the core superstructure were flawed. They were brittle, dangerously so riddled with microscopic fractures from an improper cooling process at the foundry. Over 100 tons of compromised steel had already been bolted into the building's skeleton. It was a catastrophe. It meant a delay of months. It meant a cost overrun that would run into the tens of millions. It meant a potential disaster if it hadn't been caught. And it had happened on his watch. He called Ilara immediately. It was almost 10 p.m. "I'm on my way," was all she said before hanging up. They met under the harsh floodlights of the deserted construction site, the flawed steel skeleton of Sector Delta, looming over them like a monument to his failure. The air was cold, but Mark was sweating. Ilara had the engineer's report in her hand. Her face was grim, her jaw tight with suppressed fury. "Explain this to me, Mark," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "My design is only as good as the materials it's built with. I signed off on your supplier choice. You assured me their quality control was unimpeachable. This isn't just an anomaly. This is a betrayal of the entire project's integrity." "I know," Mark said, his voice hoarse. "The documentation from the supplier was forged. We're pulling all the data now. But that's an excuse. The responsibility is mine. I'm the project manager." "Damn right you are!" She shot back, the frost in her voice turning to fire. "So what's the plan? Because right now, I have a $900 million paperweight sitting in the middle of London. I need solutions, Mark, not a confession." For the next 48 hours, Mark barely slept. He coordinated with engineers, metallurgists, and legal teams. He lived on black coffee and adrenaline. He personally supervised the initial delicate process of documenting every single flawed beam. While his team focused on the logistics, Mark locked himself in the site office and worked on the bigger problem, the schedule. He couldn't just replace the steel. He had to resequence the entire build around the delay, finding ways to claw back days and weeks from other sectors, prefabricating new components off-site, and renegotiating dozens of contracts. He created a new master plan, a document of breathtaking complexity and ingenuity. It was a salvage operation on an epic scale. At 2 a.m., on the third day, he walked into the main planning office, where Ilara was still working, her face pale with exhaustion. He laid the new plan out on the table. For an hour, he walked her through it, his voice steady and confident despite his physical state. He didn't make excuses. He laid out the problem, the cost, the timeline, and then he presented the solution. He showed her how, through a series of aggressive and innovative changes, they could mitigate nearly 70% of the time lost. It was bold, it was risky, but it was brilliant. When he finished, silence filled the room. Ilara stared at the plan. Then she looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than cool professionalism or controlled anger in her eyes. It was a glimmer of raw, unadulterated respect. "You haven't slept, have you?" she asked, her tone softer. "Neither have you," he replied. She leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. "You know, Mark," she said, her voice losing its hard edge. "When I agreed to your hiring, I had my doubts. David Chen at Innovatec thought I was Matt. He knew the story. He thought the circumstances would be a liability." Mark stood his ground, meeting her gaze. "I know. I wondered if you'd be able to function," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "I wondered if you'd be so afraid of making a mistake that you'd become paralyzed, or if you'd resent me for the power I held over your life." "Some days it's been all of the above," Mark admitted, the honesty raw and unvarnished. "But this project, this building, it deserves the best. I came here to prove I could give it that, to prove you made the right choice." He paused, taking a breath. "And maybe to pay back a debt that my family owes you." The admission hung in the air between them. It was the first time the true source of the tension had been spoken aloud in this place. Ilara looked from Mark's exhausted but determined face to the brilliant plan spread across her table. The ledger was finally being balanced not with apologies or charity, but with competence and dedication under fire. He hadn't just solved a crisis, he had demonstrated a mastery that went beyond mere management. He had shown ownership. "The debt is paid, Mark," she said quietly. "You've done the work. You've earned your place here on your own merit. Now for God's sake, go home and get some sleep. We have a building to fix." As Mark drove home through the deserted pre-dawn streets, he felt a fundamental shift inside him. The crushing weight of the unspoken debt was gone, replaced by the solid grounding feeling of earned respect. He walked into his house to find Brenda asleep in a chair in the living room, a textbook for a community college horticulture course open on her lap. She had enrolled the week before, a small tentative step toward building a new life, one rooted in the earth, far from the sky. He looked at the textbook, then at his wife's face, peaceful in sleep. He realized that they were both in their own ways, learning how to grow again after being cut down to the root. The crisis had been hell, but it had also been a crucible. He was no longer Brenda Hoskins's husband in Ilara Vance's eyes. He was Mark Hoskins, the man who was going to build her skyscraper. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like more than enough. This story is a powerful reminder that our actions, even the seemingly small ones, can create ripples we can never predict. A moment of pride, a flash of judgment, can set in motion a chain of events that leads to devastating consequences. But it's also a story about character. It wasn't a supernatural force that delivered a resolution. It was the integrity of a woman who, when given the perfect chance for revenge, chose professionalism and grace instead. It forces us to ask ourselves, how would we react in the same situation? Would we choose vengeance or virtue? Our lives are more connected than we think, and the person we dismiss today might hold the keys to our future tomorrow. If this story resonated with you and made you think, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a powerful real-life drama. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories you won't want to miss. Thank you for listening.